A little bit of a change in scenery this week, but hello everyone, my name is Jace Bain, coming to you live from the RSU Radio Studios in Claremore, Oklahoma. This is the Jace Sits podcast, and without a doubt, personally, this is our biggest interview yet. I am sitting down with Nicholas Parisi, the president of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation and author of the book Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination. Rod Serling, without a doubt, one of my biggest writing influences of all time, so to be able to talk to the Foundation today was such an honor. We're going to get into it all. The Twilight Zone, Night Gallery, Planet of the Apes, and more. What creative freedom would mean to such a big Hollywood writer in the 1960s, Rod's family, so much today on the Jace Sits podcast. Stay tuned. You've now crossed over.
The best seat in the house is wherever you hear Jace Sits.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the program. This is Jace Bain, and I am thrilled to talk today about not only one of the greatest writers in Hollywood history, but also selfishly one of my personal favorites, Rod Serling. Today, I'm joined by Nicholas Parisi, president of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation and author of Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Jace. Good to be with you.
First off, I wanted to ask you about the creation of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation and what are its main goals currently?
Well, the foundation was founded in 1985, so about 40 years ago, long before I ever became involved in it. And the foundation was founded in Binghamton, New York, which is Rod Serling's hometown. And it was started by a group of Rod Serling's friends and colleagues who just had this, it was about 10 years after Rod died. Rod died in 1975. And it was started by people who just believed that, they were passionate about the idea that Rod Serling's work should be remembered and should not be forgotten. So they wanted to do something about it. So they started the foundation. And that has been our goal ever since. The idea is to preserve and promote Rod Serling's work and legacy.
There are many people listening, around my age that may not even be familiar with the name Rod Serling at all. In your opinion, what makes him such an important and influential writer?
Well, Rod Serling had a career that is really almost unparalleled in television history, for sure. Rod Serling began writing for television really right at the very beginning of television, right at the infancy. I mean, his first script aired on a national program in 1950. And, depending on how you want to count the time, television began in, maybe 48, 49. So he was right there at the beginning. So he was truly one of the pioneers in television history. He was helping to define the form, to create the form of what a television writer was and what a television script looked like. So that's the first thing about Rod Serling, is that he was a pioneer. And Rod Serling, the first thing I tell people who may know Rod Serling only from the Twilight Zone, and even if they don't know Rod Serling, I'm sure you just say the words Twilight Zone, then they at least have some idea of what that is. But the people who know Rod Serling only from the Twilight Zone are sometimes surprised to find out that Rod Serling was truly the most prestigious writer in television before the Twilight Zone. He had just come off winning three consecutive Emmy Awards for Best Dramatic Writing, 3 years in a row, before the Twilight Zone ever began. So when the Twilight Zone began, he was at the top of the television writer echelon at that point. And then he just went ahead and gave us one of the most enduring television series in television history. So his career spans an incredible period of the beginning of television, what they called the golden age of live television in the mid-50s, and then into this immortal television series, The Twilight Zone.
My first bit of backstory with Rod was reading Anne Serling, his daughter's book, As I Knew Him, which really gets into his rich history in World War II as a paratrooper, and it even inspired the title of Twilight Zone. Could we talk a little bit about Rod's military service and how this shaped his storytelling and worldview?
Well, it's almost impossible to overestimate how much it shaped his worldview and how much it shaped him as a writer and as a human being, really. Rod volunteered for military service the day after high school graduation. He was 18 years old, and he believed in serving. I mean, this is World War II we're talking about, and not too long after this was not too long after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he was passionate about the idea that this was a righteous cause that he needed to be involved in. And, he was born into a Jewish family. He grew up very proud of his Jewish heritage, and he wanted to serve. He wanted to fight the Nazis, so he volunteered and he became a paratrooper. And, part of him, I'm sure, wanted to literally fight the Nazis, go to Europe and do that. But he was, he was assigned to serve in the Pacific, in the Pacific Theater, and he fought the Japanese in the Philippines. And he saw some major combat. He saw some terrible things. I mean, he did some terrible things, I'm sure. And it scarred him, just as it scarred every other veteran who came back, who survived the war and came back. They were, this is before there was ever such a thing known as PTSD, but Rod Serling certainly suffered from it. It wasn't called that at the time, but he certainly suffered from it. And he very explicitly said that he began writing as a form of therapy. He began writing during the military as a form of therapy. And when he came back, and when he went to college, after he came back, everything he wrote was semi-autobiographical war stories. And he said he had to do it to get it out of his gut, and onto the page. So it inspired everything he wrote at the beginning. And as time went on, he wrote about the war over and over again, before the Twilight Zone, during the Twilight Zone, and after the Twilight Zone.
And I wanted to touch on a little bit, because when I read about Rod, creative freedom seems so important to a man like him. But could I ask you why it was so crucial to him as both a writer and producer?
Well, Rod Serling was an artist, and as maybe pretentious as that might sound, he really was, and he believed that this art form of television writing, he took it seriously, and he did believe that his writing should entertain people. That was always the first goal, but he believed that writing had to have some social relevance, and that was just part of his makeup. Part of that came from the experiences he had during the war, but I believe that he just grew up with this innate sense of right and wrong, of morality, of those types of things. And when he saw that something was wrong, he wanted to write about it, or something he felt was wrong, he wanted to write about it. And it just so happened that he wrote for television. And as I get into in my book, is that the great irony of Rod Serling's career is that in television you really couldn't talk about the things that he was most passionate about. He had to constantly fight for the right to write about these things. So it was just, it was part of his makeup that he believed that you have to say something. If you felt strongly enough about something, you can't keep your mouth shut. You have to say something about something. And that's, that was his philosophy in writing. It was always that the idea that there has to be something in there where you're saying something about something.
And that's why I think he's so important to just Hollywood. But zooming out now, in what ways does the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation archive aim to keep Rod Serling's influence alive for new generations?
Well, we the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation, we do things like we sponsor a yearly scholarship to a graduate of Binghamton High School. Again, that's Rod Serling's hometown. This year, Rod was born on Christmas Day, 1924. So Christmas Day 2024 would have been his 100th birthday, and we've been celebrating the Rod Serling centennial since then, and we were able to install a statue of Rod Serling in his boyhood recreation park in Binghamton this year, and so that now stands in Recreation Park in Binghamton. And we do, when it comes to Rod Serling's films and scripts and things like that, these are things that have the potential of being lost. So we do hold on to them. I mean, a lot of Rod Serling's work prior to the Twilight Zone were on these little shows that could very easily, be lost and forgotten about. So we do keep video copies of all of these shows, as many as we can possibly get, that he wrote before the Twilight Zone. And he does have other archives around the country that hold on to his scripts and awards and things like that. But we're just kind of weird, and we're also here as an information source. I mean, we are contacted virtually every day, people looking for various pieces of information about Rod Serling's career, and that's what we provide. And we have a yearly Serling Fest in Binghamton, where we celebrate Rod Serling's work, and we always are sure to cover things outside of the Twilight Zone. So we of course cover the Twilight Zone, but also lots of things outside of the Twilight Zone. And the idea is to celebrate not only Rod's work as a writer, but the things that were important to him. Again, those messages that were so important in so many of the scripts.
And I've read a lot about Serling Fest, and it seems like such a beautiful coming together of the fan community. What were some of the highlights of last year's event, and how has the festival evolved over time, would you say?
Well, it's gotten bigger, but I like to tell people that, when you come to Serling Fest, you certainly don't have to worry about it being Comic-Con, where there's going to be 20,000 people there, or more than that, where you're going to have to be fighting through lines and things like that. This is still a fairly intimate gathering of Serling aficionados, and it's always, every year, it is the best gathering of Rod Serling experts you're ever going to find in one place. So Ann Serling is there every year, Rod's daughter. Jody Serling, his other daughter, is usually there. I am there every year, usually hosting, and just about every writer who has written a book that is Rod Serling related or Twilight Zone related is usually a guest. So last year the highlight was the unveiling of Rod's statue. So this past Serling Fest was probably our biggest and our most joyous celebration, because this was a long time coming, getting a statue for Rod in Binghamton, and we had a really, really nice gathering there to celebrate that.
Awesome. And I wanted to ask you, what kind of educational and informational materials does the foundation provide to the public, fans?
Well, usually, we have a website, rodserling.com, so that's your main source for any information. And on our website, we have links to lots of different speeches that Rod gave over the years. And that is an important piece of Rod Serling's, Rod Serling's work, is the fact that he was a very prolific orator. He spoke at college commencement ceremonies, at high school graduations. He was a very in-demand speaker, so he gave lots of speeches, and we have links or the actual text of these speeches on our website, rodserling.com. We have links to interviews with Rod. We have rare videos of Rod. And, basically, that kind of stuff. And again, if people reach out to us, we do our best to provide whatever information that they're looking for.
I've got a loaded question for you now, because being able to talk about Rod Serling is such an honor. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think Rod used drama as a tool for social justice, and how is this reflected in his work, not only in Twilight Zone, but everything he ever did?
Yeah, that is really that's the big question of Rod Serling's career. That is how he viewed his work. And the first thing you got to understand, I think, is that Rod Serling, again, when he came in at the infancy of television, he very quickly saw the potential of television as a message delivery system. He saw, and again, this is at the time when you're talking about the mid-50s or even into the 60s or even into the 70s, you're talking about a time when there was basically 3 networks. All television was on 3 networks, and you could get 20 million people watching one show at a time. The debut of the Twilight Zone drew about 18 million people. So that would be a huge hit today. Back then, it was not. It was middle of the road. So he saw that, and he believed that if you're going to reach that many people, then you have a responsibility to educate those people. You have a social responsibility to say something to those people that's going to mean something. And he really did believe that. So in television, he tried to address issues like prejudice, issues like scapegoating, issues like anti-Semitism. These were things that were important to him. And, television at the time was very, very timid to address these topics, because they didn't want to offend anybody. They didn't want to offend anybody, south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they didn't want to offend anybody, period. So Rod would run into problems, and that is, it's been a very, well-told tale that helped create the Twilight Zone, because Rod Serling was able to address those topics in the guise of science fiction and fantasy that he was having a lot of trouble addressing in straight drama.
Absolutely beautiful. And most people primarily associate Rod with just the Twilight Zone, but his contributions to Planet of the Apes are often overlooked. Could you share more about his involvement in shaping that film?
Yeah, well, Planet of the Apes, yes. And again, that is one that still surprises people to this day when they hear that Rod co-wrote the original Planet of the Apes. Rod Serling's involvement with Planet of the Apes is pretty intricate. It's kind of a long story, but the short version is that Rod was the first writer that was contacted to adapt the novel, because it was based on a novel by Pierre Boulle, or Boulle, however you like to pronounce it. And he wrote several drafts. In my book, I go through exactly, how many drafts there were and what the evolution of his script was from the beginning until the final script. But essentially what happened was, when he was writing his versions of Planet of the Apes, the project had not attracted a director yet. It had not attracted a studio yet. And primarily because the studios were very, very weary of the idea, or leery of the idea of, the whole idea of talking apes, and how are we going to make this work? Is the makeup going to work well enough? How could we make this look like something other than a Disney movie? They were afraid it was going to be, going to be laughed at. So Rod wrote several versions of the script, and by the time he had written, however many drafts it was, they decided, one thing we can do with this is reduce the budget. And by doing that, to reduce the budget, we can change the location or the setting of the story to go to a pre-industrial setting. Rod's version was in a modern setting. You had the apes in a modern city. The apes were driving cars and wearing suits and hats and things like that. And that was going to cost a lot of money. So they decided we can cut the budget by putting it into a what we now know as kind of looks like the Flintstones. So what they did was they changed the setting. And by that point, Rod was really just written out on the project. He had written so many drafts of it, and he said, you know what, that's fine with me, but I'm not going to rewrite the whole thing to change the setting. So do what you got to do. So, and they were not satisfied with Rod's scripts, to be honest, either. So they said, okay, and they brought Michael Wilson in to essentially rewrite Serling's drafts. So Michael Wilson took Serling's drafts, took that as kind of the outline and the basis, and rewrote from there. So in the end, they ended up sharing screen credit. It's screenplay by Michael Wilson and Rod Serling.
Are Rod's original drafts available to read?
Yes, in fact, a couple of them pretty regularly show up on eBay, believe it or not. If you look at it, sometimes you'll be able to find them on there. But the Rod Serling archive at Ithaca College has all of the early drafts. So you could see, it's pretty amazing to see the really early versions where it was nothing like the final version, so those are available at the Ithaca archive. If you wanted to research it, you could go there and read them.
Well, now I think we switch gears into the iconic Night Gallery. For those perhaps unfamiliar, I don't want to call it a rehashing at all, but it was definitely similar to Twilight Zone. I wanted to talk a little bit about that show and what it meant for Rod as a writer, but also Steven Spielberg showing up with his first directorial gig.
Yeah, it was Steven Spielberg's first directing job was on the Night Gallery pilot movie. He directed a segment called Eyes, which starred Joan Crawford. And not to get ahead of to back up a minute. Essentially, Night Gallery started as a book. Rod Serling wrote a book called The Season to Be Wary, and it was a collection of 3 long short stories. And it was the first collection of original prose fiction that Rod Serling ever wrote or published. And meaning that he had published collections of Twilight Zone stories and before, which were adaptations of his own scripts. But this was the first time he wrote original short stories, which were technically novellas. They call them long short stories. And 2 of them he later adapted into a Night Gallery pilot movie, which was 3 stories. And one of them was directed by Steven Spielberg. So once the Night Gallery pilot movie aired, it got really great response. It got really good ratings and really good response from the public, and it almost immediately began. It drew attention to maybe doing a series. And Rod Serling at that point was 35 years old, and he was, make sure I got that right. he was 35 years old, and he believed that he didn't want to take on that responsibility of running a show again like he had with the Twilight Zone. So he gave it, he essentially let the network do what they wanted with it. But he did think that he would have some creative control over it. Unfortunately, he didn't. He wrote a lot for it, and he wrote a lot of great stuff for it, and he narrated it, and he promoted it. But another producer had really the final say on creative decisions. And so Rod didn't have that. So that became a very frustrating experience for Rod, because his opinion was not always given the weight that it probably should have been.
And finally, about Rod's projects, it's well known that the Twilight Zone was actually canceled. And I just want to straight up ask you, why do you think that is? Why was Twilight Zone canceled and taken off the air?
Well, it technically was canceled twice, believe it or not. It was canceled after 3 seasons. But even after the 3rd season, when it was technically canceled, Rod knew that it was probably going to come back in some form for a 4th season. And that's what ended up becoming the 4th season of hour-long episodes. Originally, it was a half-hour show for 3 seasons. And then the 4th season, it was a mid-season replacement, and they increased the length to an hour and did 1 season of hour-long episodes, and then it came back for a 5th season and back at a half an hour. And after that, it was canceled. And Rod, it was kind of a mutual decision. Rod was pretty burnt out on it. He felt that he and they were repeating themselves. It started to repeat themselves. It wasn't as fresh as it had been. The ratings were still okay. The ratings were never terrible. They were never really, really great, but they were never terrible. But it kind of was a mutual decision. He really believed that it was just the right time.
Awesome. And are there any upcoming projects or initiatives that the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation is currently working on?
Well, we are now working on the next Serling Fest, which is going to be in September in Binghamton. It's going to be September 19th, 20th, and 21st. We have 3 new guests this year that we haven't had at Serling Fest before. One is Joseph Dougherty, who is a writer, an Emmy-winning writer, primarily for the show 30-something. He just published a book called Rod Serling at 100, One Writer's Acknowledgement, which is a really terrific book about really gets into detail about Rod Serling's impact as a writer, especially in his impact on him. But in general, Rod's power as a writer. So I highly recommend that book. So he'll be at Serling Fest this year. Also, Frank Spotnitz, who is a producer and writer of The X-Files, as well as Man in the High Castle and a few other things. He will be there. Again, another Serling aficionado. David Bianculli, who is a television critic, and you might know him from NPR's Fresh Air program. He will be there. And then, as I like to say, the usual cast of characters, which would be me and Ann Serling and Mark DeWidziak and Mark Olshaker and a bunch of different writers who have written or published different books about Rod Serling. So that's September. That's the big event for the foundation. That's our major fundraiser every year. And that's the main thing that we have on the horizon right now.
And all those links are down below to get involved. But I want to ask you now, how can fans and scholars contribute or support the foundation's efforts?
Just go to rodserling.com. You will see a link there to join the foundation. And by joining the foundation, it's very simple. I mean, really, it just means make a donation, and you can make a donation for any amount of money is fine. If you donate at least $25, you become a full member in good standing for the year. And that entitles you to the quarterly newsletter, as well as a physical quarterly newsletter by email, as well as a physical newsletter that we mail out once a year, and some other perks as well. So just if you go to rodserling.com, click the Join Us button, and that'll take you to the right place.
Nick, thank you so much for being a part of our episode today. I wanted to ask you one more thing before we go. In your opinion, what can young writers learn from the works of Rod Serling, and how can they apply his approach to their own writing?
Well, that's a long question.
It's a hefty one, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I think the first thing that they can learn is that don't give up, because Rod Serling, at the beginning of his career, gathered at least 40 rejection slips in a row. His scripts were rejected by every radio program in the country, because he was writing for radio at the time. They were rejected by every radio series, and then they were rejected by television. And it took Rod Serling a long time to break through. So that's the first thing. The persistence that Rod Serling had is something that every new writer can learn from. Just have a thick skin. Although Rod didn't really have that thick a skin, he was very sensitive, but he dealt with it, and he persevered. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I think there is something to be said for Rod's approach, that there should be something to your writing more than just the idea of entertainment or just the idea of titillation. Rod, again, if Rod Serling's work was just about twist endings, if the Twilight Zone were just about, finding out that the book is a cookbook, or that Henry Bemis's glasses break at the end of an episode, we wouldn't be talking about him right now. The reason we're talking about him right now is because his work meant something. And I think that you can get pretentious with that, but you also can understand that if your work is about something, it may have a little more lasting power than if it isn't.
Nick, thank you so much for being a part of the episode today. The Rod Serling Memorial Foundation, all the links are below, and the book, Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination, is available everywhere now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Really great being with you.
Once again, I'd love to thank Nicholas Parisi and the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation for being a part of our episode today. The book, Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination, are available now. All of their links are down below. Go check them out and support them. Once again, Rod Serling, probably one of, if not the biggest writing inspiration. So to have this episode, to have this interview means absolutely so much. A big thank you to the team. We're going to miss you next week on the Jace Sits podcast. But be sure to tune in to all the Jace Bain and Jace Sits social medias, which are also linked below, to know when we'll be back. Subscribe, leave a review, anything you can. It all helps us out, and I'll see you next week. You've now crossed over. This is Jace Sits.